I took a class on Jonathan Edwards in graduate school, and I thought, wow, I can't imagine like trying to read him.
It's like, what is he thinking?
I mean, I did it. It was an adjunct professor that taught it, so it was a night class. It was one of the few night classes I had, it wasn't. It was Jonathan Edwards and like the sort of revivalist movement. So we looked at. I think actually some of the other people you looked at that in that class we read too, but we read a bunch of these spiritualists and other things, but it was mostly Jonathan Edwards. Yeah. Well, we're going to get underway and probably some folks will trickle in. Did some of you have an opportunity to watch the speech? It was pretty short, actually. It was only like, what, 14 minutes or something? So if you haven't watched it yet and you have to watch it later on, know that I'm not really punishing you with a long speech. And it was pretty, in terms of inauguration speeches, aside from being short, it was pretty good. I mean, it wasn't sort of partisan or anything else. So, as I said in the email I sent to you all, take some notes because I want you to come up with 5, ethical issues or moral issues that you think he raised. Of course, I didn't have any idea what he was going to talk about. So as I watched it, I realized he didn't really talk about a lot of things that I thought he would. And then I saw later, like for the next 10 or 11 days, each day he's going to discuss some of these issues like immigration and healthcare and stuff like that. So other things might appear, but there are some ethical issues that at least he raises and talks. He doesn't really elaborate on them, but he does raise them. And so my expectation is that once you watch that, and then this will be your first reflection. So it's not due till next Thursday, a week from today. So you have a little bit of time to watch it as well. My expectation is that you'll try to name, 5 things that you think are moral or ethical issues. You'll tell me why you think it's that, and then you'll give me a few sentences on how you might address that issue, okay? And hopefully that will equal about 1 page, double space type. If it's a little longer than 1 page, that's okay. If it's a tad shorter, that's okay. But I definitely am going to mark you down if it's only a half page long or something you give me. But if it's 3/4 of a page or a page and a third or something, that's fine. And just remember, this is going to be your first effort. We'll have only talked about a couple moral theories. So I don't expect you to apply any moral theories to this. What I am hoping you'll do is just sort of begin to think about what issues might be moral or ethical issues. So, and that you can recognize those when someone's talking about them. Some of you may be Jewish or Christian, and so therefore you might know the 10 Commandments that are in the Old Testament. Just think about the 10 Commandments. What are some of the 10 Commandments if you know them?
Thou shalt not kill.
Thou shalt not kill. What else is one of the 10 Commandments?
Don't put any idols before God.
Yep, don't put anything else before God or other gods. What else?
Commit adultery.
Adultery. I don't think he talked about adultery yesterday. No. But any other ones? There's one he did mention several times, actually. And it's one of the 10 Commandments.
Like turn against your neighbor.
That's not one of the 10 Commandments, but excellent observation. That is something he mentioned, and that's certainly an ethical, the way we treat other people is an ethical issue. Lying. He talked about truth telling and lying. And thou shalt not lie is one of the 10 Commandments, right? So I'm giving you one of the 5 options of an ethical issue. But he mentioned this several times. And obviously, anybody that knows anything about politicians, one of the first things they do is when they open their mouth, it's almost 50% of the time going to be a lie. So If you know anything, you know that politicians are wont to lie frequently. But he did talk about that. So that's certainly an ethical issue that you could lift up. But he talked about how we treat our neighbors as well. Anyway, that's what I really hope you're listening for. And the reason I hope you're listening for that is because as this course goes along, you might be watching the news. You might be, even on Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or some other social media platform, and someone might raise an issue that you thought, well, gee, I don't know, is that really a moral or ethical issue? And as you begin to contemplate it, you might discern or discover or decide that it is a moral or ethical issue. I'm not suggesting that then you go and engage that person in conversation per se, but I'm pointing that out there because these are sort of omnipresent in our life. They're all over the place. And just as I mentioned the other day, when you get up in the morning, you make choices about the clothes you're going to wear or the breakfast you're going to have or not breakfast. Those can turn into ethical choices. When we engage in society, we're confronted with these all the time. So, all right. We were talking about metaphysics the other day when I stopped, and we're going to look a little bit more at meta-ethics this afternoon. And then I'm going to start to talk about some of the frameworks of moral theories, and we'll probably get through one or two of them today. We might not go the whole time today, but these are pretty heavy topics. And so they're going to take some time to digest. So we're not going to just blow through these. And as always, if you have questions, please raise your hand, stop me in the middle, that's fine. I don't mind if you interrupt me in the middle of lecture, just do it in a respectful way, and I'm happy to answer questions or go back and repeat something. So I don't like using PowerPoint, and I can do that, but I would prefer not, because one, it's sort of distracting that I have to advance things, but secondly, hopefully me going over these, you'll catch them, and it gives you that skill set of hearing and writing and so forth. And if any of you have ever taken a Dr. Plaisir class, you'll know that you're quite adept at this already. But be that as it may, when we were talking about meta-ethics the other day, I was asking these sort of what meta-ethics is, first of all, and I gave you this sort of brief statement that meta-ethics are these types of questions. Is morality just a convenient fiction? If not, can moral standards be true? And suppose that moral standards are, does their truth depend on personal opinion, social consensus, God's command, or something else? This is an important question for all of us to sort of wrestle with, because in most of society today, the way we operate with the belief that ethics are personal, meaning that what I believe is good for me, but I'm not certain whether it's good for someone else. And if you think it's good for someone else, then you believe that they have to operate and live the same way you do, okay? But what is defining that ethical code is how you understand the world, okay? That's how a lot of us operate today. And so this question about where they originate, where ethics originates, is the first and most important question, where ethics originate. Then that question of truth. If there is truth to if there's something true, how true is it? Now you might say to yourself, what kind of question is how true is it? Things are either true or false, right? Now we know that there's a gray area where there's some kind of, it might be somewhat true, but it's not completely true. But here I'm not talking about how true it is. Here I'm talking about whether we can know something to be true. So how would we know something to be true? And obviously, ethics aren't like statistics or mathematics or calculus or chemistry or something like that, where there's an equation, right? For the most part, we're not talking about equation-based theories here. So how do we know it's true then? So that becomes the next question. What's the source of truth? And then this last part of it, and this goes on, but this last part of this first section is, and do they have any authority over us? Is it always rational to be moral, or is it sometimes reasonable to take an immoral path? And so, would it be okay to sometimes act immorally? Or do you always necessarily have to follow the right path? Can you think of a time where it might be okay to act immorally?
Like a good example I always hear is like if a mother is like starving, okay, she's with her kids and the kids are starving, but she steals bread from the store to feed her kids, is it wrong? And like then it's like I don't know because like she's starving, she needs to feed her kids, but like obviously she's stealing bread, but it's for the cause of.
Okay, that's a sort of classic, that's a sort of classic example of this question. So you're a parent and you have children who are starving and you don't have a job or your job doesn't pay you enough money to feed your kids. Now we can ask all the other questions about why you have kids that you can't afford to begin with. That's a whole different question, right? But the question you presented is a classic moral example. The mother or dad goes and steals food to feed their children. Now, we know that stealing by convention, meaning that by consensus, in our society, we've decided that stealing is not moral or right, correct? Most would say that stealing isn't right. And in our society, not only have we said it's not moral, we also have made it illegal for the most part too, right? So, but then you're faced with the parent is stealing food to feed their children and presumably themselves as well, right? They're not, and so then you have to begin to weigh the morality of their action, right? Now you get into questions of consequences. Was the consequence of her stealing or his stealing, was the benefit of doing that greater than the theft they engaged in? Because by stealing, they're harming the owner of the store that they stole from, right? So, and that's, so then you begin, so this is and that's why it's a classic question that we're faced with. Another one would be a question of self-defense. You're being attacked by someone and you kill that person in the process of defending yourself. Again, we generally say that killing someone is wrong, right? And it's immoral. But in the question of self-defense, we sometimes say that that was a justified action, and we might not claim it to be immoral. Or we might say that the morality of it is it's less immoral than you dying. We might make that calculation. So this is part of ethics. Sometimes we called it what we just presented here, sort of situational ethics, in that based on the situation, you're determining the morality of something. All right. The last part of this sort of meta-ethics question is morality objective? So put another way, is there a universal morality that exists regardless of class, race, gender, linguistics, ethnic background, cultural background, religious belief, or worldview? So to put that simply, Is there a type of morality that exists in the United States, in a country in Central Africa, in a country in Southeast Asia, in a country in Latin America, in some place in Europe, that when you went to that country, every person, no matter who you met, would agree that that's a moral or immoral act, objectively, meaning that they would conclude, just like you do, that that's moral or immoral. You're shaking, your name is, by the way? Peyton, okay. Why are you shaking your head no?
Here in the United States, everyone, man, woman, has objectively the same rights, even though sometimes it's not shown. But over in the Middle East, women are held like objects and have little rights of their own. And that should be to us morally wrong, but to them, that's normal.
Okay, okay. So there might be types of behavior or the way we treat people that some societies would deem moral and other societies would deem immoral. Would you all agree with Peyton that that's probably a fair assessment? I might broaden it to beyond the Middle East because my wife is from Latin America, and generally in Latin America, women are not treated as equally as men are either. So it isn't necessarily a consequence of religion per se. It might be also a result of culture too, okay? But that's a fair observation. But that doesn't necessarily get at the question of, can we find something that's morally objectionable to all people in all places? Do you think there's, did you say something? Okay.
I was just gonna say like to survive.
Survive. Well, okay, so what does that mean to survive?
Go about your daily life.
Okay,
Try and get food. I mean,
so you would say that there's some kind of morality or objective acceptance that all people are allowed to survive.
yeah, I think that like most, well, not even put it like that. Because like, I mean, some societies are like, no, you don't have like the right to live or whatever.
Ah,
So,
well, and think about certain societies that have what we might claim a caste system, okay? Well, they grant everybody the right to survive, but depending on where you fit in that caste system, or in certain societies where they have a class system, or certain societies where they have a skin color differentiation, the right to survive might be based on what color your skin is, what caste you fit in, or what class you fit in, right? So that would negate sort of an objective morality there, wouldn't it? Because it would be situationally based on where you fit in the hierarchy of that society, right? How much your life is worth compared to Imani's life. It would be based on potentially external characteristics, or name, the origin of your name, or some other kind of characteristic that marks you. What about, do you think there's a society that thinks that lying is a good thing? And I'm not talking about the sort of lies that your parents told you that you were brought by the stork, or the Easter Bunny exists, or Santa Claus. Oh, wait, those things do exist. I'm not talking about those kind of lies. Do you think there's a society that thinks lying is an acceptable moral behavior? You're nodding your head yes. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like maybe, I can't think of anything like everyone thinks that, but I mean, there's definitely quite a bit of lying to get ahead in higher positions.
Okay, lying to get ahead, but is that moral?
No.
Okay, so this is the question I'm asking. And whether you think there's a society that you think lying sees that as a moral good. No. Why do you think lying might not be a moral good in any society?
Lose trust.
What's that?
You lose trust.
Right. And if you don't have trust, you cannot have society, right? So it's possible that lying could be something that's an objective moral good universally. What about killing?
No, I know you talked about like lying, and then I thought about it, I was like, I mean, I guess could be acceptable if it's like a dire situation, but not in a, like if it's like a life or death sort of thing, then in that scenario, I can see where it could be acceptable.
Yeah, but society's still going to say that lying is not morally good. See, now you're getting down to a differentiation of like what type of ethics we're looking at. And so lying in a certain situation might be necessary. For example, someone's holding a gun to my head and they want me to confess my, undying belief to the spaghetti monster. And I decide that I'm going to do that so the person doesn't blow my head off. Most people would say that that was an acceptable reason for me to lie and say I believe in the spaghetti monster because it saved my life. Now, if the same person was holding a gun to my head and I had to say I wanted to make you all believe something that could lead to to bad things happening to you, and I lied to do that, that might not be morally acceptable. What might, in that case, be morally acceptable is my death to protect you all from the lie that I was going to share. But the reason I bring up murder or killing or however you want to frame it is most societies, we think that killing is wrong, right? But it might not be in every society, and we certainly know that there were tribal societies that practiced cannibalism and sacrifice and these kind of things. So killing might be something that, depending on how it's perceived, ritual killing or ritual sacrifice might be something that's acceptable in some societies. So, all right. But I just want you to think about, as we move forward, whether morality can be objective, whether there's something that could be universally true for all people. All right. Some of you may know this person's name, and some of you may not. David Hume. Has anybody ever heard the name David Hume?
I've heard it, I mean.
Is he a philosopher?
He was a philosopher.
So we had talked about him in public theology.
We did indeed talk about David Hume in public theology. So his last name is Hume, and he was a Scottish philosopher during the Enlightenment. And he was the first person to argue against objective morality. This, in a nutshell, this is what Hume said. Hume thought that if moral claims were objectively true, then we should be able to discover our moral duty just by thinking hard about it. He argues that no amount of careful reasoning could do that, and therefore morality cannot be objective. Now, I've presented a case where lying, I think, might be something that's universal. But Hume's making a slightly different argument here, that if morality was objective, any person that sat down and thought like the Buddha, any person that thought deep enough would come to the same conclusion about what morality means, okay? And that means that someone sitting here in Demorest, Georgia, at Piedmont College thinking about it, and someone in Calcutta, India thinking about it, would conclude the same thing. Do you think Hume's probably right that there is no objective morality if you look at it that way? I would venture to bet that he's probably correct. However, if you take a Buddhist kind of approach to this and you think about enlightenment, the theory being that all people would achieve the same type of enlightenment, right? Which would be escape from this earthly existence. And so in that sense, if we all look at it from a Buddhist perspective, the Buddhists might say there could be some kind of objective understanding of this, because if you attain the same goal. But Hume's not looking at it that way. Hume's purely looking at it from a rationalistic perspective. People sitting down and thinking really hard, would they all come up to the same conclusion? And he's probably right that no, they wouldn't. All right. J.L. Mackie goes further in his effort to show that there are no moral truths. He argues that all of our moral thinking is based on an error. He sees morality as a product of human insecurity and imagination, with no real authority over us. He says if we all assume that morality is objective, and if Mackie is right about it being, at best, a useful fiction, then morality is bankrupt. So Mackie is making the argument that morality can't be objective because it really is, it comes out of our own security or insecurities, our imagination. Now, obviously, both of these philosophers, Hume and Mackie, are arguing against a sort of a pre-Enlightenment worldview. And before the Enlightenment, where did most Western society think morality came from? Any ideas? Church, God. Most Western society thought, and for that matter, most of the world, in fact, thought that morality came from God. And so it was imposed upon you from this transcendent being, right? Well, this is part of what they're arguing against. And so the Enlightenment was all about the power of reason, right? And the power of rationality. And so they're approaching it from a different perspective. They're not approaching it from, and obviously God transmits God's words to us through the Bible or the Quran or some other sacred text, right? And so that's what they're arguing against. We live in a post-Enlightenment world, I would say, and so most of us aren't even sure if God is the origin of morality at this point, even if we believe in God. And I'm not poking fun at that, but I'm just making the observation here. But anyway, the point being is that that's why they're making these sort of reasoned, rational arguments. Okay. Two more persons I'll highlight, and then we'll start looking at the first set of moral theories. Gilbert Harman is the next person. And Harman argues that we cannot test our moral beliefs against the world. He states that we have no external check on our moral, and he calls them opinions, no objective moral facts that might cause us to have the moral opinions we do. And so Harman is making the statement here that unlike math or chemistry or physics or biology, where you can do an experiment and there's an external thing that you can gauge your beliefs against, he's saying that there's not really a way to test that. Now, whether he's right or wrong, we'll discern throughout the semester. But that's sort of the argument he's making. And so he's making the claim that really morality is based on your own personal belief system, right? That's the sort of argument that he's making. That whatever you believe in the origin of wherever that comes from, it works for you and no one else. Everybody with me so far? Okay. All right, then the last person we're going to look at before we start looking at one of these moral theories is the moral and political philosopher John Rawls. And Rawls's last name is R-A-W-L-S. And he's going to come up later on because one of the moral theories that we're going to look at is based on John Rawls' sort of philosophical proposition. But he defines ethics this way. The two main concepts of ethics are those of the right and the good. So John Rawls says the two main concepts of ethics are the right and the good. The structure of an ethical theory is then largely determined how it defines and connects these two basic notions. Now, a lot of people might say that right and good are the same thing. But what he's saying here is that the way you define ethics is you determine something is right by how much good it produces, really, okay? And you connect those two together, and that's how you shape a moral theory. And so for him, you can't separate those two realities. And we're going to see that that's not uncommon for a lot of these theories we're going to talk about. But in order for us to talk about them, we need to understand the notion the right and the notion the good. So in this course, we're going to be evaluating the morality of actions by applying moral theories that address the nature of right and wrong action. Whether something is intrinsically, does anybody know the word intrinsically or intrinsic? What do you think the word intrinsic means?
Are you talking about like intrinsic motivation, stuff like that?
Yeah.
You do it because you want to do it?
But where does it originate from?
Oh, I don't know.
Itself.
The self. Something that's intrinsic originates from within. So you're right, intrinsic motivation, something that is intrinsic. It also intrinsic means that it's innate. It's there without some other source creating it, okay? Now, there can be things intrinsically good and intrinsically bad, okay? It doesn't, just because it's intrinsic doesn't mean it's good. It could be intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. So what would be something that you think is intrinsically good? Can someone define what they might think something intrinsically good is?
Food.
What's that?
Food.
Food? No. Food only has value, well, I mean, you need food, but it only has value because of why?
Probably.
Because we give it value, right?
And that's not self.
So what has value in and of itself? I mean, there might be some value to food, we don't know how much, right? But what has value in and of itself? What's something that's intrinsically good? I'm not saying that food is bad per se, but look at all, you go to the grocery store, look at all the stuff in the grocery store that has no real nutritional value, right? And we still consume it. And then we wonder why we weigh 400 pounds later and we're diabetic.
Is it like service, like us serving others?
Ah, okay, but that may or may not be an intrinsic good. Why?
May not be doing it for the right reasons.
Well, that, first of all, you might not be doing it for the right reasons. But secondly, it might be motivated because of something external, right? This is hard, isn't it? This isn't easy. I mean, you're coming up with great things that have value and they're important in our lives. But you're getting closer with service, though. So go ahead.
Would like, this is weird, would like giving blood be that? Like, this good comes from that.
You choose to.
Again, it's similar to the service thing. What's the motivation and what's driving them?
That makes sense. I mean, but I mean, if you are wanting to give blood because you want to help someone.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that would be like his service model. So yes, but you would have to go all those layers back, right? That's the important thing. It's just like his example, the food. We'd have to go all the layers back. So we'd have to get to the sort of like the food source, the purpose of it. Is it really providing value to, you know, But then how much, the food's a little different because it's something external to us. So the important thing to think about something that's intrinsically good is that it's going to be within us, okay? That's part of the thing. So what might, go ahead.
So the act of creating the one.
Ah.
Because you don't necessarily always have to create for other people. You could just do it for
So the act of creation, perfect. Now, again, it could be because someone's paying you to do art or create something, but that, yes, but what would be the second part of the creating? It would have to give something of value to society, right? Not just to you, but to society. The other side, intrinsically bad. What would be something that's intrinsically bad? Any thoughts on that? What might originate from you that you would see as bad or
Could it be the reverse, destruction?
okay, certainly. And not all destruction would necessarily be bad, right? So, you know, but just the act of destroying something could be good or bad, just like the act of creating could be good or bad. But those are both good examples because they really come from within. And if you think about something, small children, even very tiny children, create things, right? They draw, they scribble, that's a creation for them. And they destroy things, right? So we also know that that is something, so one of the other things that's important about thinking about this intrinsic nature is what's something that occurs even from the youngest of age, because there it's not about learning yet, right? It's not even about modeling your parents. It's really something that's generated from within the child to do, right? Now, we can still hold on to those things as adults, but it becomes more complex to hold on to those things as adults, doesn't it? Back to your service example or your giving blood example. The more we enter into the world and the more we're compromised by society, those altruistic, those things that are sort of seemingly good just for themselves, become more difficult to judge because what's the motivation? If you're, for example, the member of some kind of religious group and they do mission trips, now the mission trip itself is a good thing, but if you're doing it so you hope to get to heaven quicker or something like that, then your motivation becomes something external, right? Now, I'm not saying getting to heaven is a bad thing, but that motivation is to get to heaven. So that's why you're doing the mission trip. And so that's when those things begin to become where's the seat of the motivation and how much does the motivation influence the good you're doing or the bad you're doing, right? All right. So the other part of this is intrinsic as an adjective. So we were just talking about it as an adverb. So intrinsically good, intrinsically bad. But as an adjective, belonging to essential nature or the constitution of the person. And so the intrinsic worth of a human being. So this, if you're a person that comes from an Abrahamic faith tradition, so meaning you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, you would believe that you're created in the image of God, right? That the Abrahamic faith traditions believe that. Those traditions also believe, therefore, that you have intrinsic worth simply because you exist, that you have value because you exist. Now, I'm not suggesting other religious and cultural traditions don't hold this, but because I'm part of the Abrahamic faith tradition, I understand this better. That's so when we talk about someone's intrinsic worth, if I asked you, do you have intrinsic worth? Hopefully you would say yes as a person, because what I'm asking you is do you simply have value because you exist. Now, in our culture today, this is a complex issue. And why is intrinsic worth a complex issue in our culture today? How many of you have an Instagram account? Come on, be honest. How many of you have? This isn't a question of like whether it's good or bad. You don't have an Instagram? Okay. Do you have any social media?
Yeah.
Okay. How many of you look on Instagram to check out other people and what they look like or are wearing on somewhat regular basis? You're nodding your head. Do you do that sometimes?
Yeah.
Okay. And what are you doing by doing that? At some level, you want to see what the trends are and the fashions, right?
Yeah.
But subconsciously, you might also be judging yourself against that other person, right? Now you're starting to devalue your intrinsic worth because you're holding your worth up against someone else's. So what happens in our culture today is the notion of intrinsic worth gets diminished as we spend time comparing ourselves to other people. Does that make sense? Well, that creates what we might call moral decay. Why might that create moral decay?
If people have less value in themselves, they'll have less value in others.
And then if you have less value in others, what begins to happen?
People act very low.
Society begins to break down because you don't see the intrinsic worth in someone else. And so it becomes easier to fat shame the person. It becomes easier to call them out because they're a dork or a nerd or a jock or whatever the current lingo of some, right? It also becomes easy to disrespect the person, right? And potentially do bodily harm to the person because your self-worth has already been diminished. Therefore, you have to, in almost by nature, diminish someone else's self-worth in order to lift yours back up, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that Instagram is the culprit of this. Don't misunderstand that. Because before there was Instagram, people were doing this in other ways, right? You know, you go back to the 60s and the fashion models, they were like the size of this, leg on this table. And people thought that was beautiful. And so everybody wanted to be that skinny, right? Well, it's not healthy, it's not good, but so we've done this throughout society, but I'm lifting this up because this becomes dangerous to our societal makeup because it becomes much easier to devalue other people when we first don't value ourselves and don't see the intrinsic worth in ourselves. And that's important whether you're a religious person or not, because one should by nature believe that all people have value, right? And not because, the amounts in their bank account or the likes on Instagram or their followers on Twitter or whatever, but simply because they're a person. That's hard for us to do in our society today. And I understand that we all fall into that trap. I mean, as a campus minister and a faculty member here, I compare myself to other people, right? And I want to be as good as so-and-so, or I want to do this, So we all fall into this trap. And when you all get out into the work world, you're going to be competing for jobs. You're going to fall into that trap there too. But if we can remember that notion of intrinsic worth, it makes it harder to do that. Okay. So the first moral theory we're going to look at is consequentialism. And consequentialism is CON Sequentialism, consequentialism, from the word consequences. And this is one of the most, this and one of the other ones we're going to look at early on are two of the most basic moral theories. And these two that we're going to look at probably today and on Monday or Tuesday are the ones that many of you will probably already know at some level, even if you don't know the names. So consequentialism, consequences or effects of actions are all that matter in determining rightness or wrongness. So the consequences or the effects of one's actions are all that matter in determining rightness or wrongness. Now this would get back to Imani's, example earlier about the stealing of the bread to feed your children. Because if stealing the bread to feed your children makes sure that you and your children survive, it would be deemed morally good or okay to steal the bread. Obviously, as long as it doesn't destroy the business of the owner, right? I mean, then you get into another question. But if simply going into the Ingles or Walmart and stealing a grocery cart of food, they're not going to go out of business if you steal. Now, if every person showed up and stole a grocery cart, that would be a different story. But one person going in and stealing a grocery cart of food to feed their family is not going to put Walmart or Ingles out of business. And so the consequences of that action could be deemed morally right, simply based on the weighing of it, okay? People follow me on that? All right. Now, therefore, right action, so something that's good or right action is to be understood entirely in terms of the overall intrinsic value of the consequences when compared to the overall intrinsic values associated with alternative actions. So back to the stealing of the bread or the grocery cart of food. If I have two options, okay? One option is to go and do day labor. So I go and work on a construction site for a day and I get paid $100 for that day working on the construction site. Then I can go to the grocery store and buy food for my family, right? That's one action, and the consequences are food still and feeding my family, right? The other one is going to the grocery store and just stealing the food and feeding my family. The intrinsic value of the working is greater than the intrinsic value of the stealing, right? Even though the consequences, the results of the two are identical. So in that model, the work for the day would be deemed morally good and the stealing would be deemed wrong, okay? Now, you might not always have two choices, it might be three choices or four choices, and you might not always know your choices ahead of time, right? Or they might not be clear to you. But in consequentialism, that's one of the essential parts is weighing alternatives. Because you can't simply do the easy thing, which would be the going and stealing and say that's morally good, okay? This type of moral theory is what we call values-based moral theory. So that's the first thing about this. Second thing is you must have a fairly good idea or a good sense of what the alternative actions available to you are, okay? the next thing about this theory is it's what we call a comparative theory of right action. And what that means is the rightness or wrongness of an action depends, as I said, on how much intrinsic value would be produced by the action carried out compared to the alternative one. There's two more parts to this theory and how you use it. The next one is what we call right action maximizing. Right action maximizing. So that means you're supposed to engage in an action that maximizes the overall value. I'll run through these one more time before we move on. And then the last thing is this is an impartialist. So impartiality. So it's an impartialist moral theory. The rightness or wrongness of an action is made to depend upon the values of the consequences for everyone and not just the person engaging in the action. That's important to understand because if we go back to Imani's example of the stealing of the bread, if my action hurts the owner of the store more than it helps my family, then I'm not being impartial, right? The store owner doesn't benefit then, and so the action is deemed immoral. So what we're determining here by these sort of 5 steps we're going through is to decide whether the action we're going to engage in is going to be moral or not. Now, the first thing you're going to say to yourself, how am I going to know all 5 of these things before I do X, Y, or Z? Right? And you're not necessarily going to know all 5 of them before you do X, Y, and Z. Particularly think of it if it's a sort of critical moment situation, right? And you might have to make a judgment or decision in a quick amount of time. So consequentialism, this type of moral theory, in order to discern the morality of something, really requires you to go through these 5 steps and think about them. I'll just give you the 5 steps again, just so. So it's values-based moral theory. You have to have a good sense of the alternatives that are available to you. It's a comparative theory based on right action. So the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on how much intrinsic value will be produced. It's right action maximizing, meaning that you're supposed to maximize the good for everybody, and then it's impartialistic. So everybody's supposed to benefit somehow, yes.
What was the second one?
The second one is you're supposed to have a good sense of the alternatives, okay? So you need to sort of go into this knowing you might have 2 or 3 paths to walk down, okay? And you need to be able to discern ahead of time those 2 or 3 paths and not just sort of blindly walk down one or the other without really thinking about it. And that's why I said this is sort of a difficult process because a lot of those things might not be revealed until the end. So one of the things that you can see about consequentialism is that for you all sitting there, or for me, it's a lot easier for me to judge someone else's actions on whether they were right or wrong using this theory, right? Because I can look at all the things they should have done or didn't do or could have considered and didn't do. When you're in the situation and you're trying to do this on the fly or in real time, it's more difficult. All right. The second theory we're going to look at today, and this is where we'll end after this one, is called utilitarianism. And a lot of you have probably heard the term utilitarian or utilitarianism. And this was the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and his last name is Bentham. he was the originator, he was the philosopher that came up with the notion of utilitarianism. And then later on, John Stuart Mill sort of enlarged it. And so this has a little bit of a relationship to consequentialism, so you'll see that, but there's a basic sort of factor to this, and this is human welfare or happiness is intrinsically valuable, and that rightness or wrongness depends on entirely how we affect human welfare or happiness. So something being right or wrong depends completely on human happiness or human welfare. That's the basic core or crux of utilitarianism. And it's better the more you maximize the good, okay? So this is typically the most common moral theory that people engage in, and it's obviously the most simplistic. You go out and you do something, and if that brings more happiness than it does sadness, it's a good thing. Bottom line, that's it. And this is a subcategory of consequentialism, okay? But we often see utilitarianism and consequentialism as separate sort of categories, but utilitarianism, in fact, is a subcategory of consequentialism. The next subcategory of consequentialism is what we call perfectionist consequentialism. And perfectionist consequentialism is you value perfectionist state that human perfection, including knowledge and achievement, have intrinsic value. So if you do something to increase human knowledge, if you do something to increase human achievement, then that's a good, and that's sort of what perfectionist consequentialism strives for. And then the third subcategory in consequentialism is what we call rule consequentialism. And this sort of emphasizes moral rules. So like not lying, not stealing, not killing. And so the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on whether it's required, permitted, or prohibited by the rules. And so, and the morality depends on whether the rules are accepted by everybody, okay? So this is a twofold one. First of all, does it violate the rule itself? Does the lying, stealing, cheating, whatever violate the rule? But secondly, does the broad society accept the rule, okay? And so that's how you base that sort of, and so rule consequentialism obviously is most often looked at in the legal field, right? This is what lawyers spend most of their time engaged in. And this is how they try to determine, you know, whether you know, certain things are good or not in society. They say stealing is a bad thing, and then they have to figure out a set of rules to prevent people from stealing. But then everybody has to agree to those rules, right? Because if people don't agree to them, the rules don't matter. And so that's the twofold nature of that. So these three subcategories: utilitarianism, perfectionist consequentialism, and rule consequentialism. We're going to spend some time this semester looking at utilitarianism, probably not so much perfectionist consequentialism or rule consequentialism, mostly because perfectionist is sort of an abstract thing and rule is fairly straightforward. You know, here's a set of laws or a set of rules, and you accept them or don't. But utilitarianism is useful for a lot of basic decision making that we engage in. Because the simple fact of the matter is You know, you can fairly easily ask a question of, if I punch someone in the face, is that gonna bring them better, more joy or less joy?
But it's-
Less. But is it gonna bring you more joy or less joy?
Depends on the-
Ah. And so then you would have to weigh how big the joy is, right? And why are you punching the person in the face, right? And are other people around going to have more joy or less joy? So that's why I'm saying that utilitarianism is a fairly easy thing for us to explore, but also it's something that we engage in so often throughout our life and we just don't think about it. We do things all the time that do those kind of, address those kind of questions. All right. Thank you all. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you all on Tuesday.